Full frame cameras are getting cheaper and cheaper. Now, whether that's a used Sony a7 III or one of the new budget full frame cameras that you can buy new, we're finding more and more users are choosing cheap full frame cameras over full featured APS-C sensor cameras. The only problem with this is the lenses are still generally expensive. Most manufacturers have a cheap kit lens or maybe a nifty 50, but beyond that, you're often going to be spending as much for a full frame lens as you might be the camera body. But Viltrox has started to change all that, and they have been releasing sub $200 full frame autofocus lenses. And this particular lens is my favorite so far. It's a 40mm f2.5 lens. Now, I'll put a link to this lens in the description down below, as well as the other sub $200 lenses that they're running in this budget full frame lens lineup. They're all available on a couple of different mounts, but I expect we might see more in the future. This lens was sent out to me at no cost to myself for the purpose of making this video, but this is not a paid or sponsored video, and Viltrox had no say in the making of the video. Now, I am a big fan of the 40mm focal length. I think it is more interesting than the standard all-purpose focal length of 35mm, and given a choice, I will almost always pick a 28mm lens or a 40mm lens over a 35mm lens. I just think those are more interesting focal lengths. And if you're a new photographer looking for an all-purpose lens, 40mm is just a little bit more cropped in than 35mm. It's just a little bit easier to compose those images, and it just gives you a slightly tighter framing. It's still an excellent all-purpose lens. It's great for travel photography. It's great for street photography. It's great for portrait photography. So it's still extremely versatile. I just think it's a little bit easier to use for inexperienced photographers. Now, the first thing you should ask when we're talking about a full-frame autofocus lens for under $200 is, where have the compromises been made? And there have been a few. They are far from deal breakers, but I'll point those out as we go through the video. Now, first, when we have a look at the build and handling on the lens, this is the first place where you will see a difference between this lens and Viltrox's more premium lenses. The build quality on this lens is more in line with what you would see from any manufacturer's cheap nifty 50 or a kit lens. It is primarily a plastic body with a plastic lens hood with a metal lens mount. It has a USB-C port for updating the firmware. And when you hold the lens in your hand, it doesn't feel like junk or a toy by any means, but it certainly doesn't feel like a premium lens either. You know you are getting a budget lens. Interestingly, the body of this lens appears to be the same across all of these budget lenses that they're producing, including a 20mm f2.8 and some of their APS-C models, like they've got a 56mm f1.7, and they all use the same simple plastic body. That's one way that they have saved money. But this doesn't affect the image quality, so I don't mind that. That's probably a good place to actually save some money. Now, looking at the autofocus performance, anytime we're talking about a budget autofocus lens, you really do need to know how is the autofocus performance. And I've tested this lens on both Sony and Nikon, and in all my testing, what I found is that the autofocus is extremely accurate. If times it is a tiny bit slow, maybe slower than the fastest lenses out there, but it's similar to other lenses that use the STM motor system, which is what this lens uses. So there were a couple times when I was doing street photography that I felt like it just couldn't quite keep up. Somebody came in the frame and the motors just didn't move quick enough. I will say in video, it was sort of dead on every time, and I found it plenty fast enough for video. And I think the performance is similar to other budget lenses, like Sony makes a 50mm f1.8 lens, which is about a $260, $70 lens, something like that. And I thought the autofocus speed is similar to that. It is a very accurate lens. That is important. Autofocus is accurate, but maybe not the quickest. Looking at the optical performance, starting with distortion, you do get a very minor amount of barrel distortion. This is so minor that I wouldn't even bother correcting it most of the time. And if you get lines close to the edge of frame, you will see a very slight bowing. If you want, you can correct it in Lightroom, and there are profiles for the lens, so it's easily corrected, but it's not something that I would really worry about. Looking at Vignette, when you have a lens that only goes to f2.5 as its maximum aperture, that isn't really a huge opening. It's not like an f1.8 lens, and you don't expect there to be a lot of Vignette. The lens does have a moderate amount of Vignette at f2.8. It cleans up by f2.8 quite quickly, and in f4, it's almost completely gone and irrelevant. There certainly isn't an amount of Vignette that is troubling for me, but you do get a little bit at f2.5. Looking at chromatic aberration, when we look at the high contrast scenes in the in focus part of the images, there is essentially none. I could not find any purple fringing or any color fringing around the images, and I would say that this performance was absolutely perfect. When we look at longitudinal chromatic aberration, which is a shift in color cast in the out of focus areas before and after the plane of focus, the lens did exhibit a moderate amount of it when I was actually shooting a test chart on an angle and was trying to find it. But in real world shooting, in any of the images I shot, I didn't see any. So I wouldn't worry about it. It is there, but it's not something that affects real world images. The flare performance was actually quite good for a lens at this price point. Now, I must say, starting at an aperture of f2.5, this makes it a little bit easier to get better flare performance because lenses that have a larger maximum aperture generally have more problems. You do get a bit of a flashing or streaking when you get lights just out of frame coming in and cutting across the lens. And I don't think the flare performance is quite as good as Viltrox's top-end most premium lenses, but for a budget lens, it's excellent and it's nothing that I have any problems with. Looking at close-up image quality, it has a reasonably close minimum focus distance. It's nothing mind-blowing, and it's okay shot at f2.5, but it gets much better if you stop it down to f4. I think close-up image quality for an all-purpose lens like this that you might be using for travel is reasonably important because when you're traveling, you might want to take pictures of flowers or food or some of the details in the environment, historic buildings, museums, different details in those situations. And this lens does it reasonably well, but I think it does it best at f4 on. So for close-up images, just stop down the aperture a little bit. Looking at sharpness and detail, it is very good at f2.5. Just stopping it down to f2.8 makes it excellent, and an f4, I would say it's near perfect. For a budget lens at this price point, I actually expected this performance to be much worse than what it is. So I do think at the price point, you're going to be hard pressed to find anything sharper. And in any real world shooting, what I found is there were no images that I thought, oh, I wish that was a little bit sharper. That simply wasn't the case. The lens was plenty sharp enough. Now, looking at bokeh and background blur, I thought this was pretty good, and the thing that I really loved about it the most is it has this bubble bokeh effect. So if you've got specular highlights in the out of focus areas, you get this sort of ring around the outside of that bokeh bubble, which makes it look like a soap bubble style bokeh. I love this type of bokeh. You might like it, you might not like it, but I think it looks really great. And when we look at the interior of those bubble bokeh balls, they have a very moderate amount of texture, but it's reasonably clean. So I was really impressed with the out of focus rendering and bubble bokeh areas. I would rate it probably an 8 or a 9 out of 10, but this is a personal preference, so you might not feel the same way. But for me, the out of focus areas were just absolutely excellent. This is only the latest lens in this sub $200 full frame autofocus series of lenses by Viltrox, and I've just thrown a video on screen now. This is one I reviewed previously. That is also an excellent lens, a little bit wider angle lens, so depending on what type of shooting that you do, that might be the lens for you.